What the first Americans really lived like before Columbus ever showed up? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back, far back, before ships crossed the ocean, before anyone called this place America, and long before the maps got filled in. So get comfortable. Dim the lights, maybe put your phone face down for a bit, because tonight we're going somewhere that existed long before Europe noticed it did. This is the story of the first Americans, the people who lived, worked, argued, loved, and built entire civilizations here. Before Columbus ever got lost trying to reach Asia, and it's not a story of savages in animal skins or lonely wanderers in the woods. It's a story of builders, of astronomers, of people who farmed, prayed, and traded across thousands of miles, with no metal tools and no horses, and somehow still managed to get further than most of us ever will. Let's begin where the story probably began, in a land that no longer exists. The world before America was America about 20,000 years ago. Most of North America was buried under a blanket of ice. Glaciers stretched all the way down to what's now Chicago, which, to be fair, might have improved the winters there. At that time, sea levels were lower. So low, in fact, that Asia and North America were connected by a land bridge we now call Beringia. It stretched between what's now Siberia and Alaska, a cold, treeless expanse where mammoths grazed, and, apparently, so did our ancestors. Groups of hunter-gatherers began crossing it, not in a dramatic, we shall find the new world kind of way, but probably in the same way you might wander from your living room into the kitchen. Slowly, without realizing you've changed continents. They followed herds. They foraged. They didn't know they were founding a new chapter of human history. They were just looking for lunch. By the time the ice melted and the land bridge vanished under rising seas, people had already spread from Alaska down through Canada, across the Great Plains, and eventually into the forests, deserts, and river valleys that would shape their cultures. The first builders, if you closed your eyes and pictured prehistoric America, you might imagine tents or small wandering groups, but by 1000 BCE, parts of North America were already filled with farmers and architects. Along the Mississippi River and its tributaries, vast earthworks rose from the landscape. These were the mound builders, people who constructed enormous earthen mounds for burials, ceremonies, and perhaps astronomy. The most famous site today is Cahokia, near modern St. Louis. Around the year 1100, it was home to as many as 20,000 people. Larger than London at the time, it had wooden palisades, neighborhoods, and even suburbs. In the center stood Monk's Mound, a massive earthen pyramid the size of a 20-story building, layered by hand with baskets of dirt, because, of course, no one had invented the wheelbarrow yet. Atop the mound, archaeologists believe a great temple stood, probably built of timber and covered in bright paint or animal hides. From there, the ruling elite looked down upon a sprawling city of rectangular homes, public plazas, and fields of maize and squash stretching toward the horizon. And when the sun rose or set behind specific mounds, it aligned perfectly with other structures in the city, suggesting these builders knew more about geometry than half the nobles in medieval Europe. Aderito wasn't a lost city in the romantic sense. It was a planned one, ordered, designed, alive. And then, over time, it faded. No one knows exactly why. Climate change, resource exhaustion, or social upheaval. Pick your favorite. But by the time Columbus was figuring out how to sail west, Cahokia had already been empty for centuries. The people of the four directions further north and east, other cultures thrived. In the forests of the Great Lakes and the Northeast, the Iroquois Confederacy united multiple nations under a political system that would later impress even the Founding Fathers. Their longhouses were exactly what the name suggests: long. Some stretched over 200 feet, built from bark and wooden poles, shared by multiple families, and divided by hearth fires. Inside it was smoky, communal, and warm, like a never-ending family reunion. If your relatives were very good at diplomacy, women held significant power in these societies. Clan mothers could appoint or remove chiefs. Property was often matrilineal, so while European queens were being locked in towers, Iroquois women were managing governments. The Iroquois called their land Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse. They believed peace came from balance, and that true leadership meant listening, not shouting. It's a philosophy many modern politicians would find baffling. Life in the Southwest, meanwhile, far to the southwest, under the relentless sun of what's now Arizona and New Mexico, another kind of civilization grew out of the dust. The ancestral Puebloans, once called the Anasazi, built entire cities into cliff faces. Their stone dwellings, like those at Mesa Verde or Chaco Canyon, seemed to grow directly out of the rock, their walls blending into the sandstone. Imagine walking through those canyons 1,000 years ago. You'd see ladders connecting different levels, granaries filled with corn, ceremonial rooms called kivas sunk into the ground, and painted walls glowing red in the sunlight. They farmed in desert soil, using irrigation canals to water corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters. And at night, they watched the stars. Archaeologists have found petroglyphs marking lunar cycles, eclipses, and solstices. These weren't random doodles. They were calendars written in stone. But the desert is a cruel place. Drought came. Rivers dried up, and by the 1300s, most of these great settlements were abandoned. Still, their descendants, the Hopi, Zuni, and other Pueblo peoples, carried the traditions forward, living proof that a vanished city isn't the same as a vanished culture. The farmers of the South now. If we drift further south into what's now Mexico, the story changes again. Here, the people didn't just build cities, they built worlds. Long before the Aztecs, the Olmecs sculpted colossal stone heads out of volcanic rock. Each one could weigh 40 tons, carved with tools so primitive it's almost absurd. They didn't leave written records, but they left style. Their faces, broad, serene, powerful, stare across time like silent gods. Then came the Maya, whose cities still lie hidden beneath jungle vines. They built pyramids that touched the clouds, developed writing systems, complex mathematics, and a calendar that's been blamed for every apocalypse since 2012. The Maya weren't some mysterious lost tribe. They were astronomers, architects, and bureaucrats. They could track Venus across the night sky and calculate eclipses with bone tools and patience. And then there were the Aztecs, latecomers who built their capital, Tenochtitlan, on a lake. They engineered floating gardens, aqueducts, and causeways connecting artificial islands. When the Spanish arrived, They described it as more magnificent than anything in Europe. But that's getting ahead of ourselves, because tonight, we're not here for conquest. We're here for the world before it. The first Americans and their world daily life for the first Americans wasn't one long adventure. It was steady, practical, and cyclical. They woke with the sun. They farmed, hunted, cooked, argued, and laughed. Children played with small carved toys. Men shaped arrowheads from obsidian, their hands knowing the rhythm better than their minds did. Women ground maize on stone slabs until their arms ached, singing softly to keep the rhythm. Food wasn't just nourishment. It was identity. Maize wasn't a crop. It was a creation story. Many peoples believed humans were shaped from cornmeal, which, depending on your experience in the kitchen, feels oddly plausible. Trade networks crisscrossed the continent. Shells from the Gulf made their way to the Great Lakes. Copper tools from Michigan ended up in Mississippi. Obsidian from the Rockies appeared in the Midwest, and none of it required money. It ran on trust, kinship, and the occasional polite threat. Religion wasn't separate from daily life. It was the air itself. Spirits lived in rivers, stones, and wind. The world wasn't something to conquer. It was something to balance. It's easy to romanticize this, of course. They had wars, rivalries, and bad days like anyone else. But what's remarkable is that, without metal, wheels, or beasts of burden, they built interconnected worlds that lasted thousands of years and left traces everywhere. The forgotten sophistication, when Europeans finally arrived, they saw forests and villages and mistook them for wilderness. They didn't realize those forests had been managed for centuries. Controlled burns kept the land fertile. Selective planting encouraged certain trees and berries to thrive. The untouched wilderness was, in fact, an enormous garden. But to the newcomers, that idea was impossible. So they wrote their own version of savages wandering a blank continent, a convenient myth that made taking it easier. Yet even as their ships arrived, the old world still pulsed beneath their boots. The mounds still stood. The rivers still remembered the paths of canoes. And in the distance, echoes of drums still rolled across the plains. Let's drift there next, into the plains and forests of the early Americas, where nations without kings and cities without walls managed to last longer than many empires ever did. What happened to the children of fallen monarchs? The soft end of royalty? Hey, everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a quieter corner of royal history. The part that comes after the trumpets fade, after the battle banners are torn down, after the heads roll. Quite literally, we're talking about the children, the sons and daughters of fallen monarchs. Those small, inconvenient reminders of a dynasty that no longer exists. Because when kings lose their crowns, it's rarely the adults who suffer most. It's the ones too young to understand why their toys have suddenly been taken away, why the servants no longer bow, and why everyone has started whispering in the hallways. So, settle in, find a comfortable spot, maybe dim the lights a little, because tonight we're not chasing great battles or grand victories, just the faint echoes of royal footsteps fading down a long, cold corridor. Let's start with one of history's most famous disappearances, the Princes in the Tower. It's London. 1483. The air smells faintly of damp stone and misplaced confidence. King Edward IV has just died, leaving behind two young sons, Edward, aged 12, and Richard, aged 9. Technically, the older boy is now King Edward V, technically, because his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, has other ideas, and Richard is one of those men who always seems to have other ideas. He quickly takes charge of the boys, supposedly for their protection. He sends them to the Tower of London, which, in fairness, was not yet a prison at that point. It was the royal residence where new monarchs waited before their coronation. So nothing ominous at all. Except the coronation never happens. The boys are declared illegitimate. Their uncle suddenly becomes King Richard III. And the princes? They simply vanish. No one ever sees them again, people whispered. They always do. Some said Richard had them smothered in their beds. Others insisted they escaped, living quiet lives somewhere in obscurity. But the truth, as always, lies somewhere between royal guilt and public convenience. What we do know is that England quietly adjusted. Life went on. C-to-T-Ewan, Tower remained silent, and the idea of disappearing heirs became a strangely practical political solution. Because the thing about royal children is they represent claims, and claims are dangerous. A living child of a deposed monarch is a banner waiting to be raised. And for any new ruler, that simply won't do. Let's drift forward about a century to another unfortunate child with an overqualified family name, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary's story reads like a soap opera that went on far too long. She was queen as an infant, married off as a teenager, and imprisoned by her cousin as an adult. But what about her son, James VI of Scotland, later James of England? Now here's the irony. While Mary sat in confinement for 19 years, writing melancholy letters and occasionally plotting escape, her son was raised to distrust her completely. Scottish nobles made sure young James understood that his mother's mistakes were not to be repeated. They educated him well. They taught him Greek, Latin, politics, and the subtle art of pretending to like people you secretly despise. And it worked. James grew up to be clever, cautious, and emotionally repressed. The holy trinity of post-traumatic royalty. When his mother was finally executed in 1587, he didn't flinch. He sent no protests. no tears, just silence. And when Queen Elizabeth eventually died, James stepped into her throne with all the poise of someone who'd been rehearsing it since birth. It's a recurring theme you'll notice tonight. The children of fallen monarchs learning to survive by forgetting. Now, for contrast, let's drift over to France, because French royalty rarely missed an opportunity to turn tragedy into spectacle. Our next child of misfortune is Louis XVI, the son of Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI, the royal couple famous for their cakes, wigs, and catastrophic decision-making. When the French Revolution arrived, it arrived hard. The king was executed first, in January 1793. Then it was the Queen's turn, 9 months later. And the boy, just 8 years old, was left behind in a stone cell. They called him the Lost Dauphin. He was confined in the Temple prison, cut off from everyone he knew. His jailers, ever inventive, tried to re-educate him, teaching him to curse the monarchy, to deny his parents, and to sing revolutionary songs, because apparently nothing says equality like brainwashing a traumatized child. He never made it out. He died at age 10, possibly from illness, possibly from neglect. When his body was finally examined centuries later, modern DNA testing confirmed his identity. So, yes, the prince really did die in that prison. But for decades afterward, imposters popped up across Europe claiming to be him, because even in death, royal children never quite stay buried. And this pattern repeats everywhere. When dynasties fall, their children become either pawns or ghosts. Sometimes both. Let's drift eastward to the Russian Empire and meet the most mythologized royal children of all time, the Romanovs. In 1918, the Russian Revolution reached its inevitable conclusion. Tsar Nicholas II and his family were taken to a house in Ekaterinburg, charmingly renamed the House of Special Purpose. If you ever find yourself imprisoned in a building with that name, you can probably guess what happens next. They were executed in the basement. Nicholas, Alexandra, their 4 daughters, and their hemophiliac son, Alexei. But just like the French prince, rumors swirled for decades. Stories of Anastasia, the missing daughter, living in hiding, of secret escapes, and body doubles of royal bloodlines, surviving in disguise. DNA testing eventually ended the debate. Everyone was accounted for, but there's a reason people wanted to believe otherwise. Because it's deeply uncomfortable to imagine entire bloodlines ending in a moment. We want continuity. We want survival, even when history doesn't provide it. Let's drift south to a warmer climate and a smaller tragedy. Joan, Prince of Brazil, his father, Pedro II of Portugal, was exiled when Napoleon decided Europe wasn't quite French enough. The royal family fled to Brazil, a move that was technically brilliant, but emotionally devastating. The children, including little João, grew up in exile, shuttled between continents and palaces that weren't theirs. When the monarchy eventually dissolved, their descendants found themselves awkwardly rich and politically irrelevant, which is perhaps the most peaceful version of royal downfall you'll hear tonight. Of course, not all royal children were victims. Some learned to thrive in the shadows. Take Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, the same father of those vanished princes. Her brothers may have disappeared, but she survived. She married Henry VII, cleverly uniting the feuding houses of York and Lancaster, and together they founded the Tudor dynasty. So in a poetic twist, the sister of two doomed princes became the mother of a new line of monarchs, and her son, Henry VIII, ensured that no one would ever forget the Tudors again. No matter how much they might want to, he was embalmed, placed in a lead coffin and buried in Westminster. Then, a few centuries later, someone stole a bit of his hair. It was sold, resold, displayed in curiosity cabinets, and even tested for mercury poisoning. Apparently, he'd taken mercury as medicine for a chronic illness, which of course only made him sicker. So in the end, even Charles II couldn't escape the royal pattern. Live extravagantly, die inconveniently, and spend eternity being mildly examined by strangers. Across the ancient world, people were never as dirty as we like to imagine. They didn't have modern hygiene, sure, but they valued freshness, purity, and ritual. What it all says about royalty, when you line up these stories, a quiet pattern emerges. No matter how divine, how powerful, or how gloriously inbred a monarch was, death reduced them to logistics. Heads sewn back on, coffins repurposed, bodies moved, lost, rediscovered, reburied, and occasionally displayed for curiosity's sake. And through it all, the living argued endlessly about what to do, how to bury a symbol without burying its meaning. Because that's the real trouble with royalty. Even after death, they still cause paperwork. So, did medieval people really believe in dragons? The gilded isolation chamber palace life wasn't designed for children. By adulthood, many royals could quote Cicero, but couldn't hold a conversation without trembling. Education, it seemed, was less about learning and more about sanding off any trace of personality. Rooms were vast, furniture was sharp, and everyone spoke in whispers. Even laughter echoed ominously. Any slip, a stutter, a stumble, a spontaneous emotion was noted, discussed, and judged. They lived under a microscope polished by gossip and paranoia. Rahul's outfit will be the new one. So, in every prompt, make sure to swap out the old outfit with the new one. Let's drift now into the next part, where we'll wander through the specific lives of people whose scents defined their status. From monks who smelled of parchment and candle smoke, to queens who soaked in milk and honey, to plague doctors who stuffed their masks with desperation and herbs. Let's pause there for a breath, take a sip of tea. Listen to the quiet hum of time passing, because we're only halfway through the parade of royal misfortunes. In the next part, we'll drift through the quieter corners of fallen dynasties, the children who became nuns, hostages, rebels, or inconvenient symbols. Sometimes the end of a monarchy didn't come with executions or exiles, just silence, a door closing softly behind a forgotten name. What happened to the bodies of executed royals tonight? We're drifting back to a quieter corner of royal history, not the glittering banquets, or the coronations, or the embroidered nonsense of divine right. Tonight, we're talking about what happened after the royal story ended, so go ahead. Dim the lights. Settle in, because this one begins with the same words that ended so many reigns. Off with his head. Now, royal execution wasn't exactly a common event. For every noble who lost their head, there were hundreds who died peacefully in absurdly over-decorated beds. But the ones who didn't, they left behind stories that were somehow both gruesome and oddly bureaucratic. Because when a king or queen dies violently, the real question isn't just why they were killed. It's what on earth everyone did with the body afterward. The English, naturally, started a tradition. Let's begin in England. Because if there's one country that turned royal death into a spectator sport, it's them. We'll start with Charles the First, the man who quite literally lost his head over a political disagreement. Charles was executed in January 1649. On a freezing morning outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. He stepped calmly onto the scaffold, wearing 2 shirts, because he didn't want anyone to think he was shivering from fear. It was, in its way, very British. The executioner took one swing, clean cut, and then, as the crowd fell silent, he held up the king's head and announced, "Behold the head of a traitor," which, frankly, was a bit redundant. Everyone could see it. But the real question comes after. What did they do with it? Well, first, they sewed it back on. Yes, apparently it was important that the king's body looked whole again, at least for the burial. So his head was carefully stitched back to his shoulders, wrapped in linen, and placed in a wooden coffin. He was quietly buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor, in the same vault as Henry VIII, because nothing says poetic justice quite like spending eternity next to the man who invented your nation's head removal hobby. For over a century, Nobody touched him. Then, in 1813, some workmen opened the vault and found a mummified head, still intact, still recognizable, with the beard perfectly preserved. They politely put it back. Of course, because in Britain, disturbing a royal corpse is only acceptable if it's in the name of architectural maintenance. The Tudors, where execution was practically an HR policy, let's drift backward a bit. To the Tudors, the family that made decapitation fashionable. Henry VIII, for instance, didn't get executed himself. He was too busy executing everyone else. But his wives, well, that's another matter. Take Anne Boleyn, his unfortunate second wife, accused of adultery, treason, and, for some reason, witchcraft. She was executed in 1536 on Tower Green. Henry, ever the romantic, imported a skilled swordsman from France so the beheading would be quick and clean. And to his credit, it was. But once Anne's head was separated, the royal protocol broke down. No one had prepared a coffin, so her ladies-in-waiting reportedly found an old arrow chest, placed her body inside, tucked her head beside her, and buried her under the floor of the Tower's Chapel Royal. No ceremony, no royal funeral, just the quiet scrape of wood on stone. 300 years later, workmen renovating the chapel found several skeletons beneath the floor, one of which matched Anne's age and stature. She was reinterred properly, with a marble slab, because history may forget manners, but it never forgets a Tudor. Her cousin, Catherine Howard, met the same fate 6 years later. She was around 19 when they came for her. She asked for the block to be brought to her cell the night before, so she could practice laying her head on it. That's the kind of chilling, self-possessed calm only Tudor women seemed capable of. She, too, was buried without much ceremony. The Tower had a sort of frequent beheader program by that point. Mary, Queen of Scots, the world's most dramatic post-mortem. Then there's Mary, Queen of Scots, who might hold the title for most eventful afterlife. Mary was executed in 1587, after nearly 20 years of imprisonment under her cousin, Elizabeth Thorpe. Her death was messy. Literally, the executioner needed 3 swings to get the job done. On the third, her head finally came free, though awkwardly. Her wig came off with it. Her actual head rolled away, leaving the executioner holding a handful of fake hair and mild embarrassment. Her small dog, who had been hiding beneath her skirts the entire time, refused to leave the body and had to be carried away, soaked in blood. It's hard to top that for tragic loyalty. Afterward, her body was embalmed and placed in a lead coffin, but Elizabeth refused to allow a public funeral. Mary was buried quietly in Peterborough Cathedral, far from home. Years later, her son, James VI of Scotland, now also James I of England, had her remains exhumed and reburied in Westminster Abbey, in a grand marble tomb opposite Elizabeth's. So, in the end, the two cousins who destroyed each other's lives ended up sharing a crypt corridor. History, it seems, has a dark sense of humor. France, where revolutions made everyone equal in decomposition. Now, let's drift across the channel to France, where things got a bit revolutionary. Louis XVI was executed in January 1793. He walked to the guillotine calmly, pausing only to say he forgave his enemies. The blade fell. The crowd roared. A few men from the front row rushed forward to dip their handkerchiefs in his blood as souvenirs. Humanity, as always, was subtle. Louis's head was held up for the people to see, then placed in a wicker basket and delivered to a surgeon for verification. Because, apparently, there was paperwork involved. His body was thrown into an unmarked pit at the Madeleine Cemetery, sprinkled with quicklime to speed decomposition. When the monarchy was restored in 1815, his remains were dug up, at least some remains, and moved to the royal necropolis at Saint-Denis. A skull was identified as his, though no one could be completely sure. It's not like they labeled these things. His wife, Marie Antoinette, followed him 10 months later. She was guillotined in a plain white dress after apologizing to her executioner for accidentally stepping on his foot. That might be the most aristocratic apology in history. Her body, too, was tossed into a pit and covered in lime. When it was recovered 2 decades later, her bones were reburied beside her husband. So, at long last, they were reunited, 2 skeletons beneath marble, surrounded by the faint scent of misplaced grandeur. Russia, where royals disappeared entirely. Let's drift east into colder lands. In 1918, the Russian royal family met their end in a dim basement in Yekaterinburg. Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, their 5 children, and several loyal servants were executed by Bolshevik guards. It was brutal, chaotic, and over in minutes. What followed, though, was a decades-long mystery. The bodies were stripped, burned with acid, and dumped in a forest outside the city. For most of the 20th century, their exact resting place was unknown, fueling endless rumors that one of the children, Anastasia, had survived. When the remains were finally found in the 1990s, DNA testing confirmed the family's identities. They were reburied in 1998 in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, alongside their imperial ancestors. A century after their execution, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized them as martyrs, so, from basement to sainthood, proof that even royal corpses can experience a career comeback. Charles the Thunthers of Sweden. The cleanest corpse in Europe. Not every royal execution was planned. Sometimes a monarch simply died violently, and the aftermath was unusual. Consider Charles the Fiend of Sweden, the warrior king who was shot through the head during a siege in 1718. His body was brought home in winter, preserved by the cold. When they opened the coffin decades later, he was astonishingly intact, still wearing his gloves, his face serene, as though slightly bored by the whole experience. Swedes, being efficient, reburied him promptly. Though some continue to argue whether he was killed by the enemy or by his own men, who'd had quite enough of his endless wars, either way, his corpse aged beautifully. Let's drift south. Spain's Royal Skeleton Collection in Spain. Royal remains became an ongoing project. For centuries, Spanish monarchs were interred in the Royal Pantheon at El Escorial, a vast granite monastery near Madrid. But there's a catch. Before they go into the tomb, the bodies must first decompose completely, which means that every royal corpse spends several decades in a secret room called the rotting chamber, a ventilated vault where nature takes its course. Only after they're fully skeletal are they moved into the polished marble pantheon. It's perhaps the most organized approach to royal decay in history. No scandal, no mystery, just paperwork, patience, and a faint smell of inevitability. Denmark, meanwhile, had style Christian VII of Denmark, who ruled in the late 18th century, wasn't executed, but might as well have been. His sanity collapsed early, and his doctor and wife more or less ran the kingdom for him. When he finally died, his body was displayed with such thick makeup and perfume that visitors fainted from the smell. It was, unintentionally, the most accurate summary of his reign possible. Back to England for one more head, and finally, we circle back to Mary, Queen of Scots' great-great-grandson, Charles the First's own son, Charles II, the king who came back from exile after the execution of his father. Charles II wasn't executed, but his death in 1685 created its own strange legacy, the ancient scent of civilization tonight. We're drifting back to a world that smelled, well, not quite like lavender and sandalwood. Go ahead and dim the lights. Get comfortable, because this evening we're wandering through the ancient past, not through palaces or battlefields, but through the far less glamorous corridors of personal hygiene. It's the part of history textbooks usually skip, which is a shame, really, because it tells us more about what life actually felt like, what people touched, smelled, and endured every single day. And, perhaps most importantly, what they did about it. So let's drift slowly into the ancient world, to the first cities, the first perfumes, and the first attempts at pretending that human beings weren't just slightly smelly animals. Cleanliness. In theory now, the idea of being clean has never meant the same thing in every era. Today, we think of cleanliness as something close to holiness. Shower once or twice a day, scrub everything, use soaps, toners, and serums. We have entire aisles of stores devoted to hygiene. Ancient people didn't. For them, cleanliness was less about fighting bacteria, which they didn't know existed, and more about ritual, status, and sometimes just plain survival. Being clean could mean you were favored by the gods, or that you simply had enough water and servants to make it possible. Let's start where civilization started. Mesopotamia. It's around 2500 BCE. You're in Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates. The air is hot, dry, and filled with the smell of baked clay. People live in cities like Ur and Babylon, among the first real urban centers in human history. And yes, people were already worrying about body odor. The Mesopotamians were surprisingly advanced in cleanliness. They made soap, though not quite the flowery kind we know today. It was a mixture of animal fat and ashes boiled together. Functional, but not particularly romantic. They bathed, not daily, but regularly, in rivers or with water carried in jugs. Wealthy families even had small bathrooms, with simple drainage systems that carried waste away from living areas. Temples sometimes included purification pools. Priests had to bathe before rituals, which meant that cleanliness was linked directly to spiritual worthiness. And because this is humanity we're talking about, they also wore perfume, mostly made from cedar oil, myrrh, and juniper. The goal was to smell expensive, not necessarily clean. Egypt. The land of linen and oil. Now let's drift a bit further west, to ancient Egypt, where hygiene became an art form. The Egyptians were arguably the cleanest people of the ancient world, not because they understood germs, but because they were obsessed with purity. They bathed daily, sometimes twice a day, in the Nile or from clay basins at home. Soap wasn't quite soap. It was a mixture of animal fat, alkaline salts, and sometimes sand for scrubbing. They shaved their entire bodies, including their heads, to avoid lice. Even priests had to shave every part of themselves before entering temples. A full-body ritual of smooth devotion. And deodorant? They had it. Sort of. The Egyptians made perfumed pastes from cinnamon, citrus, and frankincense. They'd rub these under their arms, which, honestly, sounds much nicer than modern antiperspirant. For wealthier Egyptians, cleanliness was a mark of status. Linen clothing, light, white, and constantly washed, showed that you had servants to do laundry and the water to spare. Meanwhile, the lower classes did their best with river baths and clay scrubs, though the Nile wasn't exactly sanitary. But to be fair, neither was anywhere else. Greece. Where philosophy met the bathhouse next, let's drift north to ancient Greece, where cleanliness took on a new meaning. The Greeks valued the human body, not just as a shell for the soul, but as something worth admiring. Sculpting, athletics, bathing. It was all part of a shared cultural idea that beauty equaled virtue. So, yes, they bathed often, but not for relaxation, more for restoration. Greek men went to public bathhouses after exercise, where they would scrape sweat and oil from their skin with a small curved metal tool called a strigil. Imagine the ancient version of exfoliation, only involving more dust and less eucalyptus steam. After scraping, they'd rub themselves with olive oil, which served as both moisturizer and perfume. It also made them slightly flammable, but let's not dwell on that. Women's bathing habits were more private, but records suggest they also used perfumed oils and took warm baths when possible. Cleanliness wasn't just physical, it was moral. The body reflected the mind. So, in short, the Greeks invented the gym, the spa, and the idea that everyone should look vaguely like a marble statue. Rome, the empire of soap and steam. And now we float toward the Romans, who, as usual, took everyone else's ideas and scaled them up until they became infrastructure. The Roman Empire ran on aqueducts, plumbing, and, perhaps most famously, bathhouses. Roman baths were enormous, social and almost spiritual spaces. They weren't just for cleaning. They were for gossip, business deals, and showing off your toga. A typical Roman bathhouse had a sequence. First, the apoditerium, where you undressed, then the tepidarium, a warm room to open the pores, the caldarium, a hot, steamy chamber, where you sweated like a politician under scrutiny, and finally, the frigidarium, a cold plunge pool that closed everything back up again. People used strigils, oils, and even early forms of soap made from tallow and ashes. Slaves often helped scrub their masters, because of course they did. For the average Roman, the baths were a part of daily life. Admission was cheap. Even the poor could go. And for once in history, cleanliness wasn't just for the elite, but of course, the irony is that Romans were bathing in water that was often lukewarm, shared by hundreds of other people, and rarely changed. So, clean might be a generous term. Still, compared to what came after Rome fell, this was practically luxury hygiene. After Rome, the smell of the Dark Ages. Let's drift forward for just a moment, because it's hard not to notice what happens when the Roman baths close. After the fall of the empire, public bathing declined sharply in Western Europe. People began to associate baths with sin, or worse, with disease. Medieval Christians sometimes believed that washing too much was vain. Others thought hot water opened the pores to illness, which, ironically, it sometimes did, given the state of sanitation. So while the ancient world had spent centuries perfecting the art of being clean, medieval Europe would spend just as long pretending that smelling like a sheep was spiritually uplifting. But we'll get to that in another part. Back to the East. Cleanliness as devotion, while Europe grew skeptical of soap. The Islamic world went the opposite direction. Islamic law emphasized cleanliness, both ritual and physical. Daily prayers required wudu, the washing of hands, face, and feet before prayer. Full-body washing, called ghusl, was required after certain events, so in cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba, public baths, hammams, flourished. They were inspired by Roman designs but infused with religious meaning. Bathing wasn't indulgence, it was purity. Men and women bathed separately, often surrounded by marble, mosaic, and warm air scented with oils. It was a calm social ritual. And unlike medieval Europe, people in the Islamic world continued to value soap. Real, perfumed soap made from olive oil, known as Aleppo soap. It spread through trade routes and would, eventually, make its way back to the West. A clean idea slowly returning home. China. The art of fragrant modesty. Meanwhile, across the world in ancient China, hygiene had its own quiet elegance. Cleanliness was considered part of good manners, especially among scholars and the elite. People bathed regularly, though not necessarily daily, and often scented the water with herbs like chrysanthemum or sandalwood. Perfumes and powders were popular, especially among women, to maintain a subtle fragrance and absorb sweat. Hair care was just as important. Washing, combing, and arranging it properly was a sign of order and virtue. Some dynasties even had professional bath attendants at the imperial court, and large cities had public bathhouses by the Tang dynasty. As always, the poor did what they could, washing in rivers or wells when possible. But the principle was universal. Being clean wasn't luxury. It was harmony. India, sacred bathing, and then there's ancient India, where water itself was divine. The Indus Valley civilization, thousands of years before Rome or Greece, already had drainage systems, public baths, and private bathing areas. Archaeologists found the Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro, a massive pool lined with bitumen to keep it watertight. Bathing wasn't just hygiene, it was spiritual cleansing. Rivers like the Ganges were, and still are, sacred. Their waters thought to purify the soul. Daily bathing was common, even in simple villages. Soap-like pastes were made from retha, soap nuts, or chickpea flour mixed with oils. In a world where most people considered washing optional, ancient India built entire rituals around it. Smelling human again. So, if we step back for a moment, what do we see? They invented soap, deodorant, bathhouses, combs, perfumes, and even plumbing long before the modern era. If you were wealthy, you could smell like cedar, jasmine, or myrrh. If you weren't, you could still scrape off the worst of the day with ashes and water and call it holiness. And for a long, long time, that was enough. Did medieval people actually believe in dragons? Tonight, we're drifting back into the fog of the Middle Ages, a time when maps ended in monsters, saints fought reptiles the size of donkeys, and scholars wrote entire treatises on the dietary habits of beasts that didn't exist. So get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's fall asleep to the question that medieval Europe somehow took entirely seriously. Did people really believe in dragons? Now, to answer that, we have to step gently into a world where belief didn't quite work the way it does today. Because in medieval Europe, Saradino Konan Run, real was a flexible term. If something had moral value, symbolic weight, or looked even vaguely like it might have existed somewhere beyond the next village, it was, in its own way, real enough, and dragons were everywhere. The world, according to beasts, the medieval imagination was a crowded place. If you opened an illuminated manuscript, say, a bestiary, you'd find a full zoo of theology disguised as biology. There'd be the lion, the proud and noble Christ symbol who slept with his eyes open. The unicorn, a metaphor for purity, which could only be captured by a virgin, of course. And then there was the dragon, enormous, fire-breathing, with the wings of a bat and the personality of a tax collector. The average monk copying these things didn't think he was writing fantasy. He was preserving knowledge. Ancient, respected, well-documented knowledge that went all the way back to Greek and Roman authorities like Pliny the Elder, who had, unfortunately, believed almost everything he heard. Pliny described dragons as real creatures that hunted elephants in India. Yes, India, the convenient somewhere else of ancient and medieval imagination. If something wasn't true here, it was probably true there. By the Middle Ages, this idea solidified. Dragons existed, but only in faraway lands where the air shimmered strangely, and people wore interesting hats. So when medieval people said they believed in dragons, what they really meant was, we've never seen one, but someone trustworthy once did. Let's drift to the monks. Picture a monastery in, say, 12th century England, a sleepy scriptorium, candlelight flickering over ink pots, and a monk carefully illustrating the story of St. George and the dragon. He's never seen a dragon, but he's seen lizards, serpents, and the occasional drunk knight. He knows what evil looks like, and he knows that in the story, the dragon isn't just an animal. It's sin. That's really the heart of it. Dragons were convenient moral devices. They could represent greed, pride, heresy, paganism, lust, or whatever the sermon was about that. Weak, and the saint who slayed them wasn't. So much saving a village as defeating metaphorical bad behavior. It was like a PowerPoint presentation for an illiterate population. Dragons in the margins, of course. Not all medieval dragons were grand and symbolic. Some were just doodles. If you've ever looked at the margins of a medieval manuscript, you'll notice they're full of chaos. Little men playing bagpipes on the backs of snails, rabbits jousting with dogs, and yes, tiny dragons, sometimes vomiting scrolls or eating monks. These weren't religious visions. They were jokes. Medieval scribes spent years hand-copying tedious texts about moral virtue. You can forgive them for getting a little weird around folio 473. So in a sense, dragons were also medieval mascots of boredom. A convenient monster to draw when your abbot wasn't looking. Let's drift over to the maps. If the monasteries gave dragons moral meaning, the cartographers gave them geographic ones. You've probably heard the phrase, "Here be dragons." It's become shorthand for the unknown, for the edge of the map, the place where knowledge stops and imagination begins. But interestingly, the exact phrase doesn't actually appear on medieval maps. It shows up later, in the 16th century, on one globe made by the Hunt-Lennox family. Still, the sentiment was very medieval. On earlier Mappaemundi, those huge, circular world maps drawn more for God than for sailors, the edges were crawling with hybrid horrors. There were dog-headed men in India, giants in Africa, and, of course, dragons, curled up near the Red Sea or loitering by Babylon. To a medieval viewer, these weren't decorations. They were warnings, or proofs of divine mystery. A reminder that God's world was vast, strange, and not entirely human. And honestly, when your local travel radius was about 12 miles, that probably felt true. The dragon's moral resume. Let's pause for a moment to appreciate how flexible dragons were as symbols. In medieval art, they could mean nearly anything, depending on who was holding the spear. If it was St. George, the dragon was evil. Simple enough. If it was St. Margaret of Antioch, the dragon was Satan attempting to devour her for refusing to renounce her faith. She actually gets swallowed whole, then bursts out unharmed, spiritually victorious, physically covered in stomach fluids. If it was a random duke commissioning a coat of arms, the dragon was power, dominance, and please don't invade me. If it was the Welsh, the dragon was national identity, specifically a red one, growling proudly on a flag that still survives today. So while the church saw dragons as allegories of sin, ordinary people saw them as symbols of endurance, courage, or royal authority, which, in fairness, are just nicer-sounding sins. Did anyone actually claim to see one? Yes, and that's where things get entertaining. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, an early medieval history, records fiery dragons flying in the air before the Viking invasions of 793. Were they comets? Meteors? Bad dreams? Yes. In 1222, chroniclers wrote that a dragon of marvelous size was seen near the river Medway in Kent. It killed the sheep with its fiery breath. No further details were given, which usually means it was a rumor started by someone named Geoffrey. But even so, these reports were written with perfect seriousness. Because the chroniclers weren't journalists, they were moralists. Natural disasters, strange lights, and bizarre creatures were all signs, not events. The dragon in the sky wasn't proof of biology. It was proof of divine displeasure. Let's drift toward medicine, because why not medieval medicine was where dragon belief got creative. According to various herbals and bestiaries, the right parts of a dragon could cure you, if only you could find one. The fat of a dragon, mixed with certain herbs, was said to heal ulcers. Its bones could be ground into powder to strengthen the heart, and, somewhat predictably, its blood could cure blindness. These remedies appear right alongside ones involving unicorn horns and basilisk ashes. So, clearly, the pharmacy of the 13th century was a fantasy novelist's dream. But there's a twist. Some of these dragon ingredients actually existed. In a way, merchants sold bits of crocodile skin or powdered fossils, passing them off as dragon relics. It was medieval branding. A crocodile was too mundane. A dragon bone, on the other hand, could fetch a handsome price. In a world where relics of saints already included questionable body parts, sometimes 3 heads, of John the Baptist, it wasn't that hard to sneak a fossilized jawbone into the mix. The educated, opinions, not everyone, of course, believed in dragons literally. By the late Middle Ages, educated thinkers were starting to doubt. People like Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas categorized dragons as possible, but unproven. They couldn't quite let go of them, too many moral uses. But they did gently move them from real animal to rare and allegorical phenomenon. Essentially, the medieval scholars invented plausible deniability. Yes, dragons might exist somewhere far away, but their exact nature is spiritual, which is the medieval equivalent of, let's not fact-check this. It's poetic. Dragons in the East now, to be fair. The medieval West didn't invent dragons. It inherited them, badly translated, from cultures that actually liked them. In China, dragons were divine, symbols of power, fertility, reign, and imperial grace. They didn't hoard gold or kidnap princesses. They made it rain. Literally. When medieval Europeans first encountered Eastern descriptions of dragons, they were baffled. How could a creature that looked like a snake be considered good? To them, serpents were biblical villains. So, through mistranslation and cultural confusion, the dragon in Europe became a fallen version of its Eastern cousin. A beast twisted by sin rather than blessed by heaven. It's an odd sort of historical mirror. One side revering the creature as divine balance, the other condemning it as the devil with wings. The devil's lizard phase. Speaking of devils, let's not forget that by the 13th century, the Church had decided that Satan himself could appear as a dragon. It was scriptural, after all. In the book of Revelation, the devil takes the form of a great red dragon, who wages war in heaven. This made things awkward for anyone trying to draw. Dragons in decorative margins, a cute doodle, could suddenly look like heresy, but that didn't stop artists. In fact, the more dragons symbolized evil, the more fun they became to paint, and thus the medieval art canon gave us 1,000 variations of satanic lizards being stabbed by knights, monks, and saints, some of whom were roughly the size of a modern toddler, because scale accuracy was never the Middle Ages' strong suit. Let's drift back to reality, such as it was. The short answer is yes, but differently than we imagine. They didn't believe in them the way we believe in tigers or thunderstorms. They believed in them the way we believe in historical gossip, something that must have been true once, even if the details got messy. What happened to the wives of conquerors after they died? The aftermath of glory. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the quieter side of conquest. Not the battles, not the speeches, not the endless maps with arrows on them. No, tonight we're slipping into the long, echoing silence that comes after the empire is built, after the dust settles, and after the hero conveniently dies of a fever somewhere far from home. We're talking about the women left behind, the wives of conquerors, the queens, empresses, and great consorts, whose lives did not end in a blaze of glory, but in confusion, exile, or quiet political maneuvering. Because, as it turns out, when your husband spends most of his career invading other people's countries, he doesn't tend to leave behind a stable succession plan, or, frankly, much peace of mind. So, make yourself comfortable, dim the lights, and let's drift through a few centuries of royal widows trying to figure out what, exactly, to do after the war hero dies. We'll start with a familiar name, Alexander the Great. He died young. Of course, 32, probably poisoned, or possibly just a victim of his own ambition and bad wine. And like every good conqueror, he left behind a mess. His wife, Roxana, had been a princess from Bactria, a region in what is now Afghanistan. Alexander married her partly for love, or so his biographers said, and partly because she was politically useful. She was about 16 when they met. He was busy conquering the world, but apparently still found time for romance. When he died in Babylon, Roxana was suddenly a widow, pregnant, foreign, and surrounded by Macedonian generals with far too many opinions. She gave birth to a son, Alexander IV, and immediately realized the infant was both her only protection and her greatest danger. Because a royal child means a royal claim. And in the power vacuum Alexander's death left behind, that claim was practically radioactive. For a while, she was treated as the mother of the future king. But as the generals carved up the empire, her importance began to fade. Eventually, she and her young son were imprisoned by one of those ambitious generals, Cassander, who later had them quietly executed. So that was Roxana's reward for being the wife of the greatest conqueror in history. Political limbo, imprisonment, and a very early exit. She had survived the conquest of the known world, only to be undone by the men who inherited it. Let's drift a little west now, to another empire and another famous widow, Olympias, Alexander's mother. If Roxana was the victim of politics, Olympias was the engine of it. She had spent years manipulating Macedonian court life, sometimes by diplomacy, sometimes by snakes. Literally. She was said to have kept them in her bedchamber as sacred symbols. Because, of course she did, after Alexander's death, Olympias tried to protect his legacy. And by protect, I mean launch a civil war in his name. For a time, she held power. But the men she opposed eventually surrounded her, and she was executed too. Apparently, even being the mother of a god-king couldn't save you from the realities of succession. The Macedonian Empire didn't last much longer after that. In the end, the women had been as ambitious as the men. They just didn't live long enough to enjoy it. Let's drift forward a few centuries and a few empires to Rome. Because Rome produced conquerors by the dozen, and each one seemed to leave behind a trail of deeply exhausted wives. Take Julia Domna, wife of Septimius Severus, emperor in the early 3rd century. She was from Syria, intelligent, politically astute, and so relentlessly competent that even the Senate respected her. When Severus died during a campaign in Britain, Julia didn't collapse in grief. She took charge. She managed his funeral, advised their sons, who immediately started trying to kill each other. John Fates Ganantwaint, and essentially ran the empire through sheer force of will. Her sons, Caracalla and Geta, were supposed to rule jointly. They didn't. Caracalla murdered Geta in front of their mother, an act that must have really ruined family dinners. Julia somehow managed to keep her position, still acting as empress and advisor until her own death. She was one of the rare ones, a conqueror's wife who not only survived but continued to rule. Though it's worth noting that she did so surrounded by murderers, paranoid generals, and the occasional coup, so not exactly restful. The peasant's diet tells us something almost poetic, that civilization didn't rise on luxury or banquets. It rose on porridge. The world, to them, was a place of moral symbols, divine hints, and half-remembered ancient wisdom. Dragons fit right in. Let's drift east again, to the Mongol Empire, because if you thought medieval Europe had dramatic widows, Central Asia took it to another level. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, his wife Berta had already been gone for a few years, but her influence still shaped what came after. She'd been kidnapped early in their marriage, rescued and reinstated as queen after Genghis's death. It was her sons, all born of Berta, who inherited the empire, and her legacy continued through generations of imperial mothers and wives. In Mongol tradition, royal widows often wielded immense power. They managed the ulas, or royal estates, negotiated marriages, and occasionally commanded armies. One of the most formidable was Turegene Khatun, widow of Ogaday Khan. When her husband died, she became regent, ruling the Mongol Empire outright for 5 years. She dismissed her husband's advisors, installed her own, and managed to keep control over one of the largest land empires in history, all while being politely ignored by Western chroniclers who preferred to pretend she didn't exist. Her only real mistake was trusting her son, Yuyuk, who repaid her by sidelining her the moment he became Great Khan, which, in fairness, is exactly what most sons of conquerors did. By now you might notice a pattern. The wives of conquerors are rarely remembered for being loved. They're remembered for surviving, and sometimes not even that. Let's drift down to the Mediterranean for a moment, to a woman who embodied both loyalty and futility, Zenobia of Palmyra. Technically, she wasn't the wife of a world conqueror. She was the world conqueror. After her husband's death, her husband, Odaenathus, ruled Palmyra, a city-state in what's now Syria. When he was assassinated, Zenobia took over. She expanded her territory across Egypt and parts of Asia Minor, declaring independence from Rome. For a brief shining moment. She was Empress of the East. Then Emperor Aurelian invaded, captured her, and brought her to Rome in golden chains, literally. The accounts differ. Some say she died on the way. Others say she lived comfortably in a villa afterward. Either way, her empire vanished. Her story became another cautionary tale about what happens when widows aim too high. Let's drift forward again, softly, to Napoleon Bonaparte, because if anyone knew how to leave behind complicated widows, it was him. His first wife, Josephine, wasn't technically his widow. He divorced her to marry a younger woman who could give him an heir. But emotionally, she was. She stayed in her chateau at Malmaison, tending roses and writing letters, long after his empire collapsed. When she died in 1814, Napoleon reportedly wept upon hearing the news, though, to be fair, he wept about many things. His second wife, Marie-Louise of Austria, fared better. When Napoleon was exiled, she simply didn't go with him. She returned to Austria, inherited some territories, and took up with a handsome count. She lived quietly, which, given her husband's reputation, might have been the happiest ending possible. Let's drift a little further north, to the chilly courts of Scandinavia and Russia. Catherine, the Great of Russia, technically was the wife of a conqueror, Peter III. But she solved the problem of widowhood in advance by removing him from the equation. She seized power in a coup, and he conveniently died shortly afterward. Officially, of natural causes, though those natural causes included several armed guards. Catherine ruled for 34. Years after that, she expanded the empire, modernized the court, and had a string of younger lovers that would make even Henry VIII blush. In the annals of post-conquest widowhood, she stands alone, not as a relic of a fallen dynasty, but as the one who replaced it. And speaking of Henry VIII, few men created more widows than he did. In his case, most of them were made prematurely. But one of them, Catherine Parr, actually survived him. The sixth and final wife. She outlived him by a year. During that time, she remarried, quickly, perhaps too quickly, to Thomas Seymour, brother of Henry's third wife. She died shortly after giving birth, at age 36. So, technically, she survived the king. But not by much, still. She has the rare honor of being one of the few Tudor women who didn't die because of Henry VIII, which, frankly, is an achievement worth noting. Let's pause there for a moment, take a breath, maybe sip something warm, because we've drifted through centuries of war and widowhood, and the pattern has become familiar. Powerful men go to battle, and when the banners fall, it's their wives left to manage the ruin. Some survive, some rule, most vanish. But they all leave behind the same quiet truth. Empires don't just end on the battlefield. They end in drawing rooms, convents, and lonely palaces, where widows count the cost of glory. In the next part, we'll drift deeper into those private aftermaths, into the stories of widows who ruled in disguise, who were exiled, or who became living symbols of the empires that died with their husbands. Softly tragic, politely forgotten, the way history likes its women most of the time. How did medieval people actually go to the bathroom? The royal flush, that didn't exist. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a slightly less glamorous corner of medieval life. Not the knights or the kings, not the grand tournaments or the glittering feasts. No, we're going somewhere, a little less comfortable, a little more human. We're going to the bathroom. So, get cozy, dim the lights, and let's take a slow, unhurried stroll through the surprisingly complicated world of medieval hygiene. Or, perhaps more accurately, medieval attempts at hygiene. Because for all their impressive cathedrals and glittering crowns, people of the Middle Ages spent an extraordinary amount of time trying to figure out where to put things after dinner. Let's begin, as most medieval matters do, with the nobility, because, while peasants handled life's necessities in fairly direct ways, usually involving a bucket, a bush, or a corner of the field, the rich liked to pretend that bodily functions were somehow optional. Unfortunately, biology didn't agree, so kings and queens had to find elegant ways to do inelegant things. One of the earliest royal solutions was the garderobe, a term that literally means clothes, storage, because nothing says privacy quite like hanging your finest robes above a hole in the wall. Yes, that's exactly what it was. A small stone room jutting out from the castle, with a wooden seat and a vertical shaft leading down to, well, somewhere, sometimes to a moat, sometimes to the base of the tower, sometimes just to a suspiciously wet patch of grass. Garderobes were cleverly designed to drop waste outside the main living quarters, which was convenient for everyone, except whoever had to clean underneath them. But they had a secondary purpose, too. The ammonia from the waste helped kill moths and lice that liked to nest in the fabrics hung above. So, in a sense, yes, medieval people literally hung their clothes over their own toilets for pest control. Practical, slightly horrifying, entirely medieval. They woke the princes at dawn, lectured through the day, and punished them for blinking incorrectly during Latin declensions. When one Habsburg prince mispronounced a word, his tutor reportedly made him write it 100 times with his left hand. Because humiliation builds character. Now, If you're imagining a grand stone toilet fit for a king, you might want to lower your expectations. Even in royal castles, garderobes were small, cold, and often communal. Privacy was not yet a thing. Walls didn't go all the way up, doors didn't lock, and if you were the king, there was a good chance a servant would be waiting outside to, shall we say, assist with matters of royal importance. That servant had an official title, the groom of the stool. Yes, it was a real position, and it was one of the most trusted roles at court, because whoever managed the king's toilet habits also managed his schedule, his private letters, and often his political secrets. There's nothing quite like helping your monarch wipe to establish mutual trust. By the Tudor period, this post had become an actual honor. Imagine being a nobleman who bragged, "I am the Lord Chamberlain of the realm," only to be politely upstaged by someone saying, "Ah, yes, but I'm the groom of the stool." It sounds ridiculous now, but in its day, it was a path to immense influence. Henry VIII's grooms, like Sir Anthony Denny, were among the few men he trusted completely. Because naturally, you don't want your personal sanitation assistant leaking state secrets. But let's drift a little lower on the social ladder. Because most people, as you might expect, didn't have a castle with a private sewage chute attached. The average medieval townsperson had simpler arrangements. In cities, public latrines existed, usually built over rivers or ditches. In London, some were quite large. Wooden buildings with multiple seats, perched over the Thames where you could socialize. Going to the bathroom wasn't necessarily private. It was a communal experience, a bit like modern public transport. You didn't make eye contact, but you were all in it together. For those who didn't have access to these facilities, chamber pots were the standard solution. And when they were full, well, you simply opened the window. The polite phrase was, "Gardy-loo," a cry of warning meaning, watch out for the water. Then came the splash. And suddenly, you understand why medieval towns smelled the way they did. Cleanliness, as we know it today, wasn't really the point. The goal was convenience, and to get the smell as far away as possible. Monasteries, interestingly, did this quite well. They had running water systems, stone channels bringing fresh water in, and waste out. Monastic latrines were often communal too, but they were flushed by small streams, making them some of the most advanced plumbing systems in Europe. Meanwhile, outside the abbey walls, townsfolk were still throwing things out of windows. Now, it's important to remember that medieval people weren't unaware of hygiene. They just didn't think of it in germ theory terms. They believed disease spread through bad air, miasma. So, getting rid of smells was important, but not necessarily for the reasons we'd expect. Perfumes, flowers, and herbs were used to mask odors. Rich households scattered rushes, fresh reeds or straw, across the floors, mixed with mint or lavender to freshen the air. Unfortunately, after a few days, the rushes also collected food scraps, animal droppings, and general debris. Then they began to rot. So the cure for the smell was, rather poetically, also the cause of it. Let's drift now into the castle kitchens, because, strangely enough, that's where many garderobes were located. Architects of the day didn't fully separate the functions of a castle. You could have a toilet chute running right above a storeroom, or worse, beside the kitchen. The medieval concept of hygiene was based more on smell than on cross-contamination. If it didn't stink, it was probably fine. One of the more tragic outcomes of this was contamination of wells. In castles or towns where waste systems and water supplies ran close together, the two often mingled, and outbreaks of dysentery, cholera, and other delightful intestinal illnesses followed. But again, people didn't understand why. They blamed bad air, divine punishment, or the neighbor's moral failings. Anything except the hole next to the water source. Now, we can't talk about medieval sanitation without mentioning bathing, or rather, the complex relationship medieval people had with it. It's a popular myth that no one bathed in the Middle Ages. That's not quite true. They did, just not as often, and not quite in the way we'd imagine. Bathhouses were common in many medieval towns, especially across Europe. People went there to wash, socialize, and, in some cases, engage in less sanitary forms of relaxation. Monks bathed weekly, nobles perhaps a few times a month. Peasants might manage whenever the opportunity arose, say, after falling into a river. But by the late Middle Ages, public bathhouses started to disappear, largely because they became associated with immorality and disease, which is ironic, given that avoiding baths also made people sicker. So, by the 16th century, many Europeans had decided it was safer to just not. Instead, they changed linen shirts frequently, believing that clean fabric absorbed dirt from the skin. It didn't, but it felt virtuous. Let's drift back, for a moment, to the royal end of things. Because if you were wealthy, your waste disposal could be downright extravagant. King Edward I of England had a multi-seat latrine system built at Windsor Castle, with running water flushed through by hand using buckets. It was the medieval equivalent of a plumbing upgrade. The cost was enormous, but so was the smell of not having one. Meanwhile, in France, King Louis IX, later St. Louis, was known for his cleanliness. He bathed daily, which made him both unusually pious and unusually pleasant to sit beside. He even encouraged his courtiers to do the same, a royal innovation that, predictably, didn't last. And what about the ladies of the court? How did queens and noblewomen handle all of this? Delicately, and with a lot of fabric in the way. Women's clothing made using guard-robes somewhat of an athletic feat, so chamber pots were more common. Some even had servants to hold them, discreetly, behind screens or curtains. There were also close stools, portable chairs with lids and removable bowls, sometimes decorated with velvet and embroidery, because, of course, even your toilet needed to be fashionable. By now, you might be wondering, did it smell as bad as we imagine? Yes, possibly worse, but people acclimated. Cities like London, Paris, and Florence were noisy, crowded, and filled with animals, horses, pigs, chickens, each contributing generously to the atmosphere. Human waste was just part of the landscape. There were street cleaners, of course, but their work was constant and thankless. In many towns, night soil men collected waste at night and sold it to farmers as fertilizer. An efficient, if unpleasant, early recycling system. Let's take a quiet breath here. You've made it this far through medieval plumbing, and somehow it's only going to get more peculiar. In the next part, we'll drift through castles, monasteries, and battlefields, exploring how armies managed sanitation, how monks turned hygiene into ritual, and how royal architects slowly, painfully, invented the idea of indoor plumbing, so... Hoy, rest your mind for a moment. Imagine the faint sound of dripping water, the creak of a castle door, and the comforting thought that your bathroom, wherever you are, is infinitely better than anything in the 14th century. The taste of mud and porridge tonight? We're drifting back to a world that smelled faintly of wood smoke, sheep, and the kind of bread that could probably double as a building material. Go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe get cozy under a blanket, because we're going to spend the evening living the life of a medieval peasant, or, more specifically, eating like one. And before you imagine quaint loaves cooling on a stone hearth, or juicy roasts turning over a crackling fire, I should probably mention that, no, that was not happening. What you're about to hear is a week in the diet of the average European peasant between the 12th and 14th centuries. The people who did most of the work, had the fewest teeth, and somehow survived long enough to keep history moving. Monday, the eternal pottage. Let's start with Monday. Not that peasants cared what day it was. The medieval week blurred together like a never-ending field of mud and obligation. But for us, it's Monday, and breakfast is pottage. Pottage was the everything stew. Think of it as a sad cousin of modern soup. You'd take whatever you had, grains, beans, scraps of cabbage, maybe an onion if you were feeling fancy, and you'd boil it until it stopped resembling food. Then you'd keep it simmering all day, adding to it as needed. Every family had a pot hanging over the fire that rarely went cold. Sometimes that same pottage pot kept going for weeks. It just lived there, slowly evolving like a damp ecosystem of lentils and despair. If you were especially poor, which most people were, your pottage was little more than oats, water, and a pinch of salt if you'd managed to trade for some. If you had a garden, lucky you might throw in leeks or turnips. The truly luxurious might add a piece of bacon fat, not to eat, but to wave around the pot for flavor. Bread, but not the good kind. With your pottage, you'd probably have bread. Now, medieval bread deserves its own moment of silence, because frankly, it was terrible. The finest white bread, called manchet, was for nobles. The middle classes got wheaten loaves, and the peasants? They got maslin or black bread, made from a mix of rye, barley, and whatever else hadn't molded yet. Rye, unfortunately, was prone to a fungus called ergot, which caused hallucinations, convulsions, and sometimes death. So yes, it's quite possible that a decent number of medieval villagers spent their mornings mildly poisoned and didn't even notice. Bread wasn't fluffy. It was dense, dark, and heavy. Sometimes people used stale bread as a kind of plate, called a trencher. You'd put your stew on it, let it soak up the liquid, and then, if you were hungry enough, which you were, you'd eat the plate. Tuesday, a little beer with your starvation. By Tuesday, you might be ready for a drink. And you'd get one, because medieval water, especially in villages, wasn't always clean. So people drank ale, even children. But before you imagine a hearty pint of something frothy and refreshing, note that peasant ale was weak. It was called small ale, and it had less alcohol than modern beer, about 1–2%. The goal wasn't to get drunk. It was just to avoid dysentery. Brewing ale was a domestic job. Wives and daughters often made it in small batches, using barley or oats. It spoiled quickly, so people drank it fast, and then brewed more. On Tuesdays, a working man might have his breakfast ale, then a bowl of porridge, and then maybe some stale cheese if it hadn't turned green. Meat? Rarely. Fish? Only by command. Let's pause for a moment to talk about meat. Because yes, medieval people did eat it, occasionally. But peasants? Not much. Game like deer or boar was reserved for the nobility, and poaching, even catching a rabbit, could technically get you executed. So meat was usually limited to domestic animals that had reached the end of their usefulness. An old hen, a lame sheep, or a pig slaughtered in autumn and salted to last the winter. The church also had rules. No meat on Fridays, and often none during Lent or Advent, meaning for nearly half the year, peasants were voluntarily vegetarian. Though, in truth, they were already halfway there. Fish replaced meat on those days, but only for those near rivers or coasts. Inland peasants might see salted herring once in a blue moon. Otherwise, Lent was mostly an exercise in eating watery gruel and praying for death. Wednesday, cabbage. Again, midweek meals didn't differ much. Breakfast, or breakfast, if we can even call it that, was small ale and a hunk of bread. Lunch might be cold pottage. Dinner would be warm pottage. Cabbage was a staple because it was cheap, easy to grow, and almost impossible to ruin. Though the medieval cookery books found ways, you could stew it, mash it, or pickle it in brine so strong it burned your throat. In fact, historians think medieval villages smelled overwhelmingly of fermented cabbage, wood smoke, and manure, which really sets the mood for a cozy dinner. Thursday, cheese and desperation. By Thursday, the bread's gone hard and the pottage's gone gray. But maybe, just maybe, you have cheese. Medieval cheese wasn't the creamy, meltable kind. It was dense, crumbly, and tasted somewhere between chalk and sour milk. It was made mostly from sheep or goat milk, since cows were expensive to feed. Still, cheese kept you alive. A lump of it with bread and onions could be a meal. And if you were lucky enough to live near a monastery, you might even get butter, though many couldn't afford it, and used dripping, rendered animal fat, instead. Friday. Fish. But not the good kind. It's Friday, so no meat. Time for fish. If you lived near the coast, congratulations. You might have fresh herring or eel. If not, your options were dried cod or salted fish, so tough it needed soaking for hours before you could chew it. Fish days were supposed to be spiritually cleansing. In reality, they were gastrointestinally challenging. Even the monasteries, where food was far better, wrote complaints about the endless fish dinners during Lent. Monks were supposed to fast, but they still managed to invent dishes like almond milk porridge and fake fish pies made of fruit. The peasants, meanwhile, were left gnawing on salted mystery fillets that might have been anything. Saturday. Market day. If you're lucky. Saturday was sometimes a small reprieve. Market day. If your village was near a town, you might walk there to sell eggs, wool, or vegetables, and spend a few coins on luxuries. Maybe honey, onions, or dried fruit. Markets also meant gossip, ale, and a faint glimpse of life beyond your field. You might even smell roasted meat from a merchant's stall and, for a fleeting moment, remember that other people ate differently. At home that night, you'd have the same old stew, but maybe, if you splurged, you'd sweeten it with a drop of honey or throw in some dried peas. Medieval excitement at its peak. Sunday. Bread and blessings, and then came Sunday. The one day peasants rested, or, rather, were forced to rest by church law. You'd go to Mass. Maybe wash your face first, or maybe not. Then, if your Lord was generous, he might hand out bread, ale, or even meat scraps as charity. A Sunday feast for a peasant wasn't extravagant. It might be a bit of pork, a fresh loaf, and ale that wasn't sour yet, but it was enough to lift spirits for a day before the next week began. The same week, really, looping endlessly until harvest or plague or war interrupted. The seasons of hunger, of course, not every week looked like this. In winter, when stores ran low, meals shrank to almost nothing. Some peasants boiled grass or bark to survive. Spring was called the hungry gap, the period between when winter stores were gone and new crops hadn't grown yet. In bad years, whole villages starved. Chronic malnutrition was normal. Teeth rotted, bones softened, and children were lucky to see adulthood. And yet, somehow, life went on. People laughed, sang, and kept boiling their endless pottage. A brief word on peasant drinks. We've talked about ale, but there were other liquids. Cider was popular in some regions, especially in England and France. Milk, not so much. It spoiled quickly. People might use it to make cheese or butter, but rarely drank it. And wine? Forget it. That was for monks and nobles, unless you lived in a vineyard region, in which case you might get a sour, cloudy local brew. The irony is that peasants drank constantly, just weak, low-alcohol ale all day. So, technically, the medieval world was a bit tipsy all the time, a final taste. So, what did medieval peasants actually eat in a week? Mostly the same thing: grain, pottage, ale, and whatever scraps the land or their lord allowed. It wasn't a menu, it was survival. But within that bleak repetition, there was rhythm, a kind of quiet persistence that kept Europe alive while its kings and popes played their endless, disastrous games of power. It was scriptural after all. In the book of Revelation, the devil takes the form of a great red dragon, who wages war in heaven. This made things awkward for anyone trying to draw. Dragons in decorative margins, a cute doodle, could suddenly look like heresy, and for many centuries nobody had any reason to doubt them until explorers and scientists began mapping, measuring, and quietly realizing that the further they went, the fewer monsters they found. But even then, they never truly disappeared, because dragons weren't just a species. They were an idea, and ideas, as history shows, have a much longer shelf life than flesh. Let's drift, next time, into something a little more royal, and a lot more dysfunctional. But for now, imagine that faint smell of cabbage and barley fading into the distance, and drift off, knowing you'd probably have been very hungry in the 14th century.